if we go to Tiruvannamalai in southern India, we find this sacred red hill. And the legend is that the ground near it is not at all touched by the four oceans that become agitated at the close of the Yuga. The Yuga is a world age, when the annihilation of all living beings takes place. All the future seeds are certainly deposited here. Brahmins who resort to the foot of that mountain are called by me after the deluge, and I make them study the Vedas. In other words, this is being typecast as a place of refuge from a global cataclysm, from the flood, where the wisdom of the past age will be passed forward to the future age. And the temple that stands on at the foot of the Red Hill today, Tiruvannamalai, is an intriguing place, and there are still sadhus who come there from all over India. But what's interesting is that in the Tiruvannamalai area, there are indeed submerged ruins underwater. Here at Pumpahar, for example, a gigantic U-shaped structure. And here at Mahabalipuram, where we find the famous rock-hewn temples of Mahabalipuram, Santa and I were told by Tamil fishermen that there was a city underwater. And we went to the Scientific Exploration Society in Britain and managed to put together an expedition to go and check out what the fishermen were telling us. As you can see, it was a very high-tech expedition. And off we went, and we dived in the bay off Mahabalipuram, and lo and behold, it turned out that what the fishermen were telling us was absolutely correct, and that there is indeed a city underwater, and that this city extends as much as 5 kilometers out from the shore. It became impossible for archaeology to deny it because that bay was emptied during the Boxing Day tsunami. And many people saw these ruins for themselves before the sea came rushing back in. If we continue along this longitude grid, we come to Angkor in Cambodia, which is exactly 72 degrees of longitude east of Giza. And there are 72 major temples at Angkor. I'm fully aware that these temples were built around 1150 AD, but I believe they're the latest incarnations of much earlier sacred sites on the location that we know as Angkor today. And here we see Angkor Wat itself. And by the way, Angkor has a meaning in ancient Egyptian. It means life to the Horus. And here is the causeway running east-west through the center of Angkor Wat. And if you position yourself on that causeway at dawn on the spring equinox and look east, you find that something very similar to what happens at Giza is taking place. There's the Sphinx looking at the rising sun at dawn on the spring equinox. And here's what happens at Angkor as the sun slowly rises up the central tower and eventually positions itself perfectly on top of the central tower. And again, you know, you have a moment of epiphany that this is what Angkor is all about, that it is a place as above, so below, that will unite heaven and earth on that special day, and that it is speaking the language of precession. I got into a lot of trouble for the so-called Draco correlation at Angkor, that the principal temples appear to be laid out in the pattern of the northern constellation Draco, the dragon, which is seen in many cultures as a serpent. And the principal imagery at Angkor is of serpents, particularly Vasuki, a famous serpent of Indian myth. And it seems to me that the correlation is actually quite close. But what's eerie about it is that it only works on the spring equinox in 10,500 BC, the same time that the correlation works at Giza. So, why am I showing a picture of the Hoover Dam? Well, it turns out that there's a star map in the Hoover Dam, and that star map freezes the skies above the Hoover Dam on the date of the dam's completion. And the artist responsible, Oscar Hansen, stated that he believed that in remote ages to come, intelligent people with knowledge of precession would be able to discern the astronomical time of the dam's dedication. I mean, in a sense, who gives a damn when the Hoover Dam was built? But what this tells us is that it's not an alien idea in our culture today to use architecture and the stars to send a message to the future. You don't want to send a message 10,000 years into the future written in the language of the day. Nobody may be able to read it. The document may not even survive. You want a language that's universal, that any developed human culture will be able to grasp and understand, and that is the language of astronomy and architecture. The ancient Egyptians, this is the pharaoh Seti I showing his young son Ramesses II, the list of all the pharaohs who'd ruled before their time, had a concept of their own history. And they believed that it went back far before the first dynasty, so-called, far before 3000 BC. And these king lists, which are used by Egyptologists to derive the orthodox chronology of Egypt, annoyingly for Egyptologists, don't stop at 3000 BC, but go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years into the past. So it's interesting that behind the Temple of Seti I is this huge megalithic structure of completely different character, which was excavated from beneath 50 feet of silt, the so-called Osirion. Maybe it wasn't built by Seti I. Maybe it belongs to an earlier period, and maybe these gigantic megaliths weren't always moved in the way that Egyptologists want them to have been moved. Maybe there was a kind of psychic magic being deployed. Maybe the myths and traditions that speak of the priests singing the blocks into place have something solid to them. Certainly there are many gigantic megalithic structures at Giza, and it's long seemed to me that these belong to a different epoch from 2500 BC. And that we may be looking at two-phase construction, that the ancient Egyptians may have worked on those temples and may have moderated them and overbuilt them and built around them, but may not have been responsible for the original megalithic core. This becomes all the more pointed when we realize that the blocks in these temples were excavated from around the core body of the Sphinx. Therefore, if there's any argument that the Sphinx is older than 2500 BC, it follows that these temples are older as well. And this is where the work of John Anthony West and Professor Robert Schoch of Boston University that I featured in Fingerprints of the Gods is so important, because they have shown that the Sphinx was the subject of thousands of years of erosion by heavy, heavy rainfall. And we don't get that kind of rainfall in Giza in the last 5,000 years. So geologically, the Sphinx appears to be much older than 2500 BC. Well, the killer argument that Egyptology gave back to that when John West and Robert Schoch planted this bomb under the comfortable bottoms of Egyptology, the killer argument was that the Sphinx can't be 12,000 years old. It cannot be, because if a culture was capable of creating the Sphinx 12,000 years ago, there would be other big monuments around the world that are also 12,000 years old. Mark Lehner famously said, "Show me the potsherd that's been left behind by that civilization." There's none. So the geology has to be wrong. The Egyptology must be right. The Sphinx must date to 2500 BC. Well, what has thrown a huge spanner in the works of that argument is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Really not even very far from the Sphinx. And Göbekli Tepe, as I'm sure Andy has been discussing earlier today, is 12,000 years old. And what's rather special about it is that the site was deliberately buried and shut off. For the last 10,000 years, that site has been pristine. No culture has been marching over it and perhaps interposing carbon from a later period, because you can't date stone. You can only date organic material found associated with the stone. And this is why it's so clear that Göbekli Tepe is 12,000 years old, because there is no contamination from later cultures. It's a time capsule. This is the general appearance of Göbekli Tepe. And I'm here talking to Klaus Schmidt, who is the lead archaeologist who excavated Göbekli Tepe, is in the process still of excavating Göbekli Tepe. And what he's telling me rather emphatically is that the stuff they've dug up at the moment is just 1/20th, perhaps even only 1/50th of what is still under the ground. That they've done ground-penetrating radar over the site, and these few stone circles that we look at today are just a tiny fraction of what remains to be excavated. And you know what? He's not actually intending to excavate all of it. He's going to run out of money in the next few years, and he's probably going to wrap up the excavation. I do understand the conservation argument to not excavating all of this site, but this site is, in my opinion, the single most important archaeological site in the world right now. And I think it justifies a full and complete excavation so that we can get of it, because frankly, hunter-gatherers don't just wake up one morning and decide to create a site with 50-ton megaliths. They don't wake up one morning and suddenly have the skills to mobilize, organize, feed, and water hundreds of men to cut and manipulate stone, to lift that stone into place. There has to be a background to this. And that background, I personally think, is likely to be a lost civilization, the survivors of a lost civilization settling at Giza. Andy may have a different view, but that's the view that I hold. Here's the unfinished pillar, which was not ever removed from the quarry because a fault was found in the rock. But this one would have weighed 50 tons if fully raised up. I think what Göbekli Tepe does is it raises question marks over megalithic sites virtually everywhere else in the world. Like these extraordinary megaliths at Baalbek in the Lebanon. They've been handed to Rome because there's a Roman temple of Jupiter on top of them. But maybe the Romans did build the temple of Jupiter, but were not responsible for the megaliths. Maybe the megaliths are from a much earlier period. And if we look at the general form of Göbekli Tepe, it's really astonishingly similar to the megalithic temples of Malta, such as Menidra that we're looking down on here. Now, the Maltese temples are slotted in by archaeology between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, 3,000 and 4,000 BC. They're considered amongst the oldest megalithic temples anywhere in the world. But that is not a date that threatens history. If you can have megaliths being organized by a Neolithic agricultural society in that period. What's much more threatening to history is the idea of 12,000-year-old megaliths. But I think what Göbekli Tepe does is it means we need to look again at the dating of all sites like this. Because unlike Göbekli Tepe, the Maltese temples have never been a time capsule. They have been contaminated by later cultures. Is it possible that the carbon dating record is wrong? Is it possible that the temples of Malta, like this Hypogeum, which is an amazing underground temple, should be on anybody's bucket list in Malta, that they may be much older than 5,000 years ago? And maybe these goddess figures that were found in the Hypogeum, and that have therefore also been dated to 5,000 years old. Maybe they're much older. Maybe they could even be as old as the Upper Paleolithic, like other goddess figures dating back 35 or 40,000 years. Why should the goddess figures of Malta be just 5,000 years old? Because that comfortably fits into the framework of history that the temples are said to occupy. And there's red ochre paint on the ceiling and walls of the Hypogeum. And here, a friend and colleague of mine, Anton Mifsud, who's the chief pediatrician at the main hospital in Valletta, and a gifted amateur archaeologist, has proved a thorn in the flesh of Maltese archaeology, because he has exposed a scandal, which is that there was once a painting of an animal figure on the walls of the Hypogeum. In fact, it's documented in a number of books. It's documented in David Trump's book, one of the fundamental archaeological texts about Malta. But that bison bull, a hybrid creature that was half bison and half bull, cannot be found on the walls of the Hypogeum anymore. And the reason it can't be found was that it was scrubbed off by the director of the Maltese Museums, F.S. Malia. He actually deliberately removed it from the walls because it suggested that the Hypogeum might belong to the Upper Paleolithic rather than to the Neolithic. So I'm sitting in these so-called cart ruts with Anton Mifsud. And these cart ruts, if that's what they are also thought to date from the megalithic period in Malta. But the unfortunate fact is that they continue underwater to depths of 110 feet beneath the water in areas that have been submerged for more than 12,000 years. If we go further west, we come to the Balearic Islands and the very interesting island of Menorca, which has an extensive megalithic culture of its own. And here are the T-shaped megaliths of Göbekli Tepe, and here are the almost identical T-shaped megaliths of Menorca. Again, I want to raise the question, have the Menorcan megaliths, which are thought to be only 3,000 or 4,000 years old, have they been misdated because of contaminated carbon? And are we, in fact, looking at a much older site here than we think? If we cross the Mediterranean from Menorca, we come to North Africa. And it's interesting that many ancient maps show huge lakes present in the Sahara Desert. The last time that there were lakes present in the Sahara Desert was during the last ice age. And what all these maps have in common is that they are copies of older source maps, now lost to us. And I went into this whole issue of the maps at great length in Fingerprints of the Gods. Here's our beautiful planet as it looks today. But back during the Ice Age, we had ice caps 2 miles deep sitting on top of North America and sitting on top of Northern Europe. And all that ice, of course, was frozen water that had come out of the oceans. Therefore, sea level was 400 feet lower than it is today. This is the world as we know it, and this is the world of the Ice Age, with substantial differences. No Red Sea, no Arabian Gulf, Sri Lanka joined to India, vastly extended Southeast Asia, Australia joined to New Guinea, and so on and so forth. 10 million square miles of land that was above water then is underwater today. And that's why it's very interesting to look again at the much derided Piri-Reis map, the map of 1513, created by a Turkish admiral called Piri-Reis. Now, the reason he made this map, and only a fragment of it has survived, it was once a world map, he tells us in his own handwriting on the map that he had come across a cache of ancient maps, actually more than 100 ancient maps, which he thought had originally come from the Library of Alexandria. And these ancient maps were in such a fragile state, so worm-eaten, so falling apart, so crumbling away, that he decided to preserve the information on them by consolidating everything in them into his world map. And the fragment of his map that has survived shows us the west coast of Africa, the east coast of South America, and it shows us off the coast of North America this very interesting island here, roughly in the location occupied by the Grand Bahama Banks today. That island no longer exists. It did exist during the Ice Age, but if we take a close-up look at it, we can see that running up the middle of the island is a long row of megaliths. And those megaliths are just identical to the now submerged so-called Bimini Road. Of course, archaeologists say that the Bimini Road is a natural phenomenon. I don't really care whether it's natural or not. I think what's interesting is that it's documented above water on a map based on much older source maps now lost to us. This suggests that somebody was mapping the world when the Bimini Road was above water, i.e. more than 12,000 years ago, i.e. a lost civilization. The Piri-Reis map also controversially shows Antarctica. And this is how Antarctica looks today, but this is how it looked on honest maps of the early 1800s, because our civilization didn't discover Antarctica until 1818. So if you're an honest map maker and you are drawing a map of the world, you leave a gap where Antarctica is in 1800 because you don't know that it exists. So it's a great puzzle that Antarctica shows up again and again on many much older maps, maps from the 15, 14, 1600s. And again, these maps are based on older source maps now lost to us. They seem to be mapping the world as it looked during the last Ice Age. Look at this little island off the coast of Ireland here called High Brazil. Such an island did exist 12,000 years ago when sea level was hundreds of feet lower. And the greatly extended coast of Southeast Asia doesn't look like Southeast Asia in the 1500s or today, but does look a lot like Southeast Asia during the Ice Age. And while we're on the subject of Southeast Asia, I want to draw attention to another extraordinary site, which I will be visiting in early December, and it is called Gunung Padang, and it is in West Java in Indonesia, quite near the city of Bandung. And Gunung Padang has been known about for a long time. It was discovered in the early 1900s, and it has been dated to between 3,000 and 4,000 years old, which doesn't threaten the mainstream model of history at all. You can have a megalithic site between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. But here again, one of those annoying geologists has come up with some contrary information. And his name is Danny Hillman, and it's Danny who's invited me to go to Indonesia in early December, where his team will be revealing their full findings. He works for the Indonesian government, and he has been conducting a site survey at Gunung Padang. And that site survey has gone on for 5 years. And what he says is that Gunung Padang is older than 9,000 years and could be up to 20,000 years. It's a strong case, but not an easy case. We're up against the world's belief. In other words, again, as Robert Schoch found when he confronted the mainstream paradigm, there's a reference frame of how history should unfold. And if you have evidence that contradicts that reference frame, it's very difficult to get that evidence accepted. In the case of Göbekli Tepe, they've had to accept it, but it's astonishing how little mainstream archaeology is actually saying about Göbekli Tepe. I mean, this incredible site is really not getting the coverage and attention that it deserves. And now, in Indonesia, we have another site where, again, the suggestion is that the site is much older and has been radically misdated by archaeology. So this is what Gunung Padang looks like. It's made of these hexagonal basalt blocks. And I want to take you over here to Ponape, which is, again, on the processional grid, because structures made in exactly the same way are found on Ponape as well. And indeed, pyramid-shaped hills, rather like the artificial pyramid-shaped hill at Gunung Padang, is found at Ponape. And this is the famous site of Nan Madol, made of these identical basalt blocks that we found at Gunung Padang. And it's thought to be only about 800 years old, based on radiocarbon of organic materials found around the site. But the problem is that the site continues underwater. You can just dive down and keep on going, down and down and down. And eventually, around about 100 feet under the waves, you come to these huge pillars standing up from the seabed, some of which have fallen. And like this one here, which bears a striking resemblance to the megalithic pillars on the island of Tinian, not very far away. And again, what I'm saying is, this is 110 feet underwater. It was last above water more than 12,000 years ago. It raises the possibility that other megalithic sites have also been radically misdated. This is a map of Japan, made in 1424. And it shows the 3 main islands of Japan, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, as one landmass. And it shows a deep inlet here and another deep inlet there. And that's actually exactly how Japan looked about 12,400 years ago, when the 3 islands were one landmass, and when there was a deep inlet here and here, around what is now the island of Shikoku. So let's go diving off Japan. These megalithic pillars of the island of Yonaguni are regarded as totally natural by mainstream archaeology. They have to be natural because they've been underwater for 12,000 years, and mainstream archaeology says there was no culture capable of architecture on this scale 12,000 years ago. This is how they're situated, against the edge of a huge rocky outcrop. And the suggestion is that they just kind of fell into place there, perfectly, without breaking. They just situated themselves there. But if we swim around to the side of this rocky outcrop, we come to the famous terraces of Yonaguni. And these, again, are said by archaeology to be totally natural and not man-made in any way, because there was no culture 12,000 years ago capable of creating a monument on this scale. This is the way the argument works. That the sea beating against this rocky outcrop selectively removed the softer layers and left the harder layers in place, and that's why we get this stepped appearance. Well, if there was something to that argument, then I would want to see the rubble down here, because there's a big drop-off down here. There's the terraces, and the drop-off actually has at the bottom of it a perfectly manicured path with all the rubble gathered to the side of the path, and indeed with drainage, with gutters running alongside the path. And if we continue our exploration of Yonaguni, we find this spooky face underwater with 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth gazing perfectly due south. And there are pupils in the eyes, and the head of the face is nicely demarcated from the rocky outcrop out of which it was cut. And if you look closely, you can see the remnants of a headdress on top of this figure here. I'm absolutely certain that this is the work of man and not the work of nature. And if we pull back further, we find again one of these avenues with gutters alongside and what appears to be a sort of ceremonial plaza. But this is the underwater site in Japan that really settles it for me. This is off the island of Okinawa, about 40 miles west of Okinawa, off the Kerama group of islands. And it's a series of stone circles. Some of them are very small. They're actually river stones, and they appear in some way to be cemented to the seabed. But some of them are very, very large. And they're not built in the way of a megalithic circle. They're actually cut out of the bedrock. And I have not been able to find any geologist who could tell me a natural process that could have cut this out, because the scale is really quite enormous. There's the central upright and the surrounding spiral of megaliths of one of the circles. And again, if we look closer, 110 feet beneath the waves, the central upright, the outer curve is matched by the inner curve of this outer upright here. Not the work of nature, not at all. Let's hop over now to Easter Island, also on the precessional grid. But Easter Island is the exception that proves the rule, because Easter Island today, what's left of Easter Island, that little bit that's called Easter Island today, is actually not on the grid. It's about 70 miles off the grid. But interestingly, if you wind back time to 12,000 years ago and earlier, when sea level was much lower, you find that Easter Island was part of a gigantic archipelago of seamounts which stuck above the waves, and the largest part of that archipelago was precisely on the 216-degree line of the precessional grid. And it's here that Professor Robert Schoch, who did the incredible work on the Sphinx, has come up with a new and very important insight. This is Rano Raraku Quarry. Santa and I have been there many times since the early 1990s. It's an amazing place, very spooky and wonderful place to spend time. And you might imagine that these statues are just buried a few feet under the ground, but Thor Heyerdahl, who I had the privilege of knowing, proved that wrong back in the 1950s when he excavated the statues. And what he shows, that's Thor there in his blue safari suit. And what he shows is that the statues are they actually go 30 feet under the ground. And what Robert Schoch has done is he's studied this infill, and he's found that it is sedimentation, that these statues have been submerged by sedimentation. They've been covered by sedimentation, and you don't get 30 feet of sedimentation in 700 or 800 years. You need to have thousands of years to get that level of sedimentation on Easter Island. Something else as well, these statues all have arms and hands with rather long fingers. And here you can see, there's the fingers and hands of the Easter Island statue. And interestingly, the Göbekli Tepe pillars have hands, arms, and fingers as well. You can see it more clearly in this slide. The crooked elbow and the fingers across the belly. Very, very similar to the appearance of the Easter Island statues. And indeed, another statue from the Göbekli Tepe area, from Urfa, dating about 1,000 years later than Göbekli Tepe, shows that same hand posture across the belly. There are some excellent megalithic walls on Easter Island, and this is one of them, again with an ancient sunken Easter Island statue beside it. Perhaps it was originally placed on top of that wall and fell off it. And if we look at the construction of that wall, we can see it's very finely done and rather similar to this megalithic wall in Peru at a place called Silustani near Puno in Peru, close to Lake Titicaca. And again, if we go here, we can see that there's a kind of jigsaw puzzle pattern. You can see that little piece inserted there in this Easter Island wall, and you have exactly the same thing happening at Silustani. There's great similarities of architecture between these two walls. And again, it was Thor Heyerdahl who first suggested that whoever built the megaliths of the Andes may have been responsible for the original megalithic layer at Easter Island. And here's the famous site of Sacsayhuaman in the Andes, just an extraordinary place to go. I mean, this is just a tiny fraction of a wall hundreds of feet long, where these huge megalithic blocks weighing 100, 150 tons each are slotted together in a massive, ambitious three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, all the edges seeming almost to melt and flow into place. Mainstream says this is the work of the Incas. And the Incas were a relatively recent culture. In fact, they dated from about the same period as the Aztecs, roughly from 1300 to 1500. And they were brought down by the Spanish. The Inca Empire was only 200 years old when the Spanish arrived. But everything that you see in the way of architecture across a huge swathe of the Andes is attributed without question to the Incas by mainstream archaeology. So you go to Sacsayhuaman and they will tell you that the Incas built this. And they'll also tell you that the Incas built this very different style of architecture that we find actually just opposite those megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman, cut from solid rock. And that the Incas built this amazing little rock-hewn shrine. Look at the perfection of that rock cutting there. Some horrendous vandal at the beginning of the 20th century, or in the 20th century when they were building the railway to Machu Picchu, came along and drilled a hole in here and planted dynamite in this. Tried to blow it up because they thought there might be treasure in it. So we're looking at what's left of it. And if we step back, we can see that there's a beautiful rock-cut wall on the side here. And there's that little shrine. And then off here, there's a very inferior piece of architecture, which looks like completely different work. But all of this, according to the mainstream model, is supposed to be the work of the Incas. So there I am with Jesus Gamarra, looking at what he regards as the earliest layer of construction. And he doesn't think it's hewn out of solid rock. He thinks that there was some system for softening the rock, perhaps using heat, and that these are more the impression of molds into that softened rock. And he doesn't find any tool marks which suggest that it's been cut out. And this kind of astonishing thing, this has actually fallen away here from the side. There was this little narrow stairway, and at the bottom of it, down here, is a hole in the ground, now filled in by the Peruvian government, which is said to be a tunnel that leads all the way to the Coricancha in the heart of Cusco. So Jesus is saying that this kind of stuff, this stuff is the earliest layer. He dates it back tens of thousands of years, actually. And then this he puts at about 12,000 plus years ago, the work of a megalithic culture, but again commanding techniques that we don't fully understand today. I mean, go figure how these three-dimensional 100-ton jigsaw puzzles were made. You can't get a sheet of paper between the joints, and they just seem to melt and flow and fit together. Not a single stone is the same size as another one. How could anybody set out deliberately to make the architecture so difficult for themselves? Everything is incredibly, overwhelmingly complicated, and yet there it stands. Somebody did this. There I am as a younger man standing in front of one of those gigantic stones. And associated with them, you find vitrification of stone, definite signs of vitrification. Huge heat has been applied to these stones, and these astonishing precision-cut channels. This is the island of the moon, sacred to the Incas. And this was the place where the virgins who would marry the Inca was the name of the king, from whose number would be selected the wife of the king, were kept. So this was an incredibly important site to the Incas. You could imagine that they did their best work here. And that's the suggestion. This is the best Inca work. And everything else we're seeing isn't Inca at all. It's pre-Inca. It's much older. We need to rewrite the history of the Andes entirely. Places like Ollantaytambo with these huge megalithic blocks. And there we find on the wall at Ollantaytambo the imagery of stepped pyramids. And actually, we do find a stepped pyramid in the Andes at Tiwanaku in Bolivia. It's called the Acapana Pyramid. And this enclosure is called the Calasasilla. And Tiwanaku is thought to date again by the mainstream. It's older than the Incas, but it's thought to date about 200-300 years after Christ. There's a strong argument that Tiwanaku also is much older. And part of that argument depends on the gateway of the sun. And the suggestion, there's another motion of the Earth which changes the solstitial rising points of the sun over long periods of time. And the suggestion that the astronomy of the Calasasilla suggests that the Calasasilla was originally laid out around 10,000 BC. Huge blocks of stone up there. at 14,000 feet above sea level. Let's take a closer look at this one here, which is just mind-boggling, actually. I mean, mind-boggling to move something on that scale anywhere, but to do it 14,000 feet above sea level absolutely beggars belief. And then we find all of these beautifully, almost machine-like pieces of stone, which almost feel when you study them as though they had metal parts that were fitted into them, and the metal parts aren't there anymore. They seem like the end blocks of something, almost like a piece of machinery. It's a really very mysterious place, Tiwanaku. There's these H-shaped blocks, and I just want to draw attention to the fact that the H motif appears regularly at Göbekli Tepe. Of course, it didn't mean H like it means to us in our alphabet, but it's interesting that the same symbol that we see as an H shape also occurs at Tiwanaku. And this is a place called Cotimbo in the Andes, quite near Lake Titicaca. Again, it's all given to the Incas. It has these amazing towers on top of it. And the towers, when you get closer, are fantastic works of architecture for a start, and turn out to have animal figures carved into them. And I'm not going to make a big deal of this. I just want to draw attention to some curious similarities, some stronger than others. Some of the similarities are not so great. Some are much stronger. Like the Göbekli Tepe figures, pillars, many of them have animal figures carved on the side. Here, the penis of this animal, and here at Cotimbo, a very similar posture is found on that creature. The similarities here with the curving of the tail of a leonine creature that we find at Göbekli Tepe and Cotimbo. And this weird creature from Göbekli Tepe and its counterpart at Cotimbo. And at Göbekli Tepe, you have a salamander, and almost designed in exactly the same way a salamander at Cotimbo, serpents at Cotimbo, serpents at Göbekli Tepe. This is the Temple of the Moon near Sacsayhuaman. That's a serpent with a large head. It's almost more like a newt or a sperm than a serpent. And that same kind of serpent is found on a pillar at Göbekli Tepe with the sinuous body of the serpent and that huge head, more like a sperm or a newt than a serpent. And that's the front of that pillar. There's those serpent heads. And if we go to the front of the pillar, you can see the serpent heads with their bodies down the side. And then there's this little figure in the middle, which again I see strikingly similar to these little figures from Cotimbo. And here in Tiwanaku, that figure, that whole statue with the serpents on the side, and the figure has hands laid very like the hands of this pillar from Tiwanaku, and that pillar also has serpents along the side of it. Bearded human head there, by the way. I'll come to that. These are the famous statues of Tiwanaku. Again, the hands are in that familiar posture. What they're holding, ancient aliens would say that's ray guns from outer space. Well, no, I'm sorry, they're not ray guns. There's a bit of a segue here to another interest of mine, but these are actually snuff trays for inhaling dimethyltryptamine, DMT, the most powerful hallucinogen known to man. And it speaks of a connection between Tiwanaku and the Amazon. Now, this is the work of Dr. Manuel Torres, an ethnobotanist, and it's now accepted that he's right. Actually, you can see this on the plaques at Tiwanaku itself. They accept that what they're holding are snuff trays, very similar to ancient snuff trays from the Amazon jungle and used to snuff the powdered seeds of an Adenanthera colubrina. So let's just quickly visit the Amazon and remind ourselves of the astonishing journey of Francisco de Orellana, a Spanish conquistador, who went hunting in a small boat up here in December 1541, but didn't reckon with the current of the Amazon River. In August 1542, he ended up in the Atlantic Ocean. He traversed the entire length of the Amazon, and he reported the existence of huge cities in the Amazon. And forever afterwards, he's been regarded as a liar, who was simply trying to glorify himself by claiming that he'd seen amazing magical things in the Amazon. How could there be cities in the Amazon? The Amazon is a pristine jungle, the haunt of hunter-gatherers. You don't find any cities there. Well, the tragic clearances of the Amazon are changing that picture. We now know that there were huge cities in the Amazon, and that Francisco Orellana was right, and that their inhabitants were wiped out by smallpox brought by the Spaniards. And something else in the Amazon is this amazing soil called terra preta, the black soil, which you find dotted in certain areas around the Amazon. It's been studied by scientists. Turns out it's a man-made soil filled with bacteria and biochar, and it constantly regenerates itself. It's incredibly fertile to this day, but it's been discovered to be more than 11,000 years old. Are we looking at the remains of a lost civilization of the Amazon? Is the Amazon like a desert, like the ocean, a place where archaeologists don't go, which is hiding the story of the human past? And I think this is a very real possibility and has to be considered seriously, because emerging from the cleared Amazon jungle are these huge geoglyphs and earthworks, and indeed even stone circles, megalithic circles are being found. This is in Brazil. And I just want to go back to this diagram involving the Sphinx, Orion, Draco, this huge project to use precession and architecture to draw attention to a date that can be pinned down between 10,000 and 11,000 BC. Are we being told that something of great significance for the world happened in this period? That's a hypothesis. Could there be something happened then that the ancients wanted to tell us about, that changed everything, that changed the game? Something perhaps that led to the destruction of a great global civilization, and something on a scale that would justify the initiation of gigantic architectural projects around the globe to mark and commemorate it. And that's something we now know is a comet. And what I'm showing here is comet Shoemaker-Levy 9, which many of us remember from 1994. Shoemaker-Levy 9 collided with Jupiter. And it was a spectacular series of impacts. The comet was broken into multiple fragments, like just a gigantic lethal freight train whizzing through the solar system. And Jupiter's gravity drew it in, and the comet exploded spectacularly on Jupiter. If that comet had not been drawn in by Jupiter, if it had come into the inner solar system, if it had hit the Earth, none of us would be here today. The Earth would have been sterilized by those impacts, which is a good reason to say thank you, Jupiter. We really owe a lot to Jupiter. In fact, arguably, there would be no life on planet Earth were it not for that gigantic guardian of our planet, circling in the outer solar system and drawing in lethal comets and destroying them. The life could not have existed if Jupiter were not there to protect the Earth from these horrendous impacts. But occasionally, a comet gets through. And we now know, it's been an argument since 2007, but the evidence has become more and more firm. And really, it's no longer an argument anymore. It's been through the mill of scholarly argument, and it's accepted. A giant fragmenting comet did hit the Earth around 10,900 BC. In fact, 10,980 BC, to be exact, 12,980 years ago. And another mystery has been solved by this, and that mystery was called the Younger Dryas. You see, just when the Earth was coming out of the last ice age, about 13,000 years ago, it was suddenly plunged back into a 1,000-year deep freeze. And that 1,000-year deep freeze has been known for a long time as the Younger Dryas, but nobody understood what caused it. Now we get it. The comet impact threw a huge amount of dust into the upper atmosphere, cloaked the entire Earth in dust, shut off the sun's rays for 1,000 years, and caused that deep freeze. The new evidence that's emerging is that at least some fragments of the worst impacts were in North America and Canada, and some fragments of the comet, it seems, actually hit the ice cap, what was left of the ice cap at that time, and in addition caused devastating floods. Massive outburst floods. These floods have traditionally been attributed to the bursting of glacial lakes. It now looks much more likely, and I want to cite the work of Randall Carlson here, it now looks much more likely that these massive floods in that period just after 13,000 years ago were caused by the vaporization, the liquefaction of the ice cap as gigantic fragments of comet smashed into it. And again, this is just following the scientific argument. They go back and forth, but they're getting it now. A comet did wipe out the first North American prehistoric humans. Ice core data suggests the cosmic impact killed off the Clovis people. I would say this is the smoking gun. I don't think it killed off just the Clovis people. I think this is the cause of the loss of a whole episode of human civilization. This was a cataclysm gigantic enough to wipe out a whole civilization from memory. And when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, I couldn't say what the smoking gun was. I looked at a number of scenarios around the end of the Ice Age. This is a key piece of new evidence which makes the likelihood of a lost civilization extremely high. And in closing, I see Hugh about to come here and tell me I've got 5 minutes. In closing, let's just go back to Egypt and look at the Temple of Horus at Edfu, which is like one of those ancient maps, where an ancient document that was fragile and falling apart, but of great importance to the ancient Egyptians, was preserved by copying it. It was copied onto the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu, and thus made permanent. And it's called the Edfu Building Texts. And it's a document that speaks of the homeland of the primeval ones, which was destroyed, an island actually, which was destroyed in a gigantic cataclysm and a flood, and many of the gods were drowned, which is an odd thing to happen to gods. But the survivors came to Egypt and settled in Egypt and established religion in Egypt and created the primeval mounds around which would be the site of all future temples and pyramids in Egypt. This is the story of the Edfu Building Texts. In other words, civilizing heroes, survivors of a cataclysm who bring knowledge and wisdom to a devastated world. Could they be a bit like the legend of Viracocha in the Andes? We see figures of Viracocha at Tiwanaku, and interestingly, he is profusely bearded, which is very unusual to find in the peoples of the Andes. He looks like somebody from a different land or a different culture. On the side of this Viracocha pillar, there is a serpent. And again, I don't want to make too much of this, but this weird little creature, which is actually, I've turned it on its side here, is actually up here on the head of the figure, looks a whole lot like Toxodon. And Toxodon is an animal that went extinct in the Andes between 13,000 and 12,000 years ago. If this is Toxodon, then this statue is extremely ancient, much more ancient than archaeologists agree. And what about those stories of Quetzalcoatl and those white-skinned, bearded strangers who came in remote prehistory, bringing civilization to Central America and who were later driven out but promised to return? These bearded figures are found in the oldest archaeological strata of Mexico and are always associated with the imagery of the feathered serpent. It was said when Quetzalcoatl was driven out of Mexico that he fled on a raft of serpents, serpents woven together in a raft. And here at Göbekli Tepe, on one of the pillars, we have an image of serpents woven together in a net or a raft. Those are the heads and tails of the serpents. So the bearded figures from Mexico, which certainly do not look at all like indigenous American Indians. And if you look closely at the Easter Island figures, you can see that they're bearded as well, that those extravagant, huge chins are actually beards, and the beard is quite clear on a number of the figures. So I want to close with these bearded men and ask two questions. One, why is he wearing a fish on his head? And two, why is he carrying a man bag? These cute little man bags that we see here. Could it be his stash of DMT? I don't know. But it's interesting. The fish on the head, actually, we know about that. This figure represents a character in Babylonian and Sumerian myth, and he's called Oannes. And he is said to be a civilizer who survived the flood, who swam through the flood, emerged from the waters of the ocean, and brought civilization back to a devastated land. And the fish symbolism symbolizes his ability to survive the flood. But what about the man bag? And why is the feathered serpent carrying the same man bag, and indeed holding it in exactly the same way? It's not just the bag, it's the hand gesture as well. That's really interesting. This is the other side of the world. This is Mexico. The other one's from Sumer, Babylon. What's going on? Is it a coincidence, or is there some connection? Could we be looking at a badge of office of the survivors of a lost civilization here? And what makes that connection firmer to me is the fact that man bags are also found on the Göbekli Tepe pillars, where we know that they are 12,000 years old. There's a lot to look into here. I'm just really beginning this work, and I've just shared this evening some of the background and some of the tantalizing clues that intrigue me. I hope it's been of interest.